a young woman in a northern Manitoba small town decides to walk home alone at night. And in the morning, a young man makes a terrible discovery.
The viciousness of it, I don't think you ever really prepare for that kind of stuff.
Despite evidence and lots of rumors, there's a town that's unwilling to talk.
Because at the end of the day, it's not just a family who wants justice, it's the entire community.
I think it's really important to remember her story because of the symbol of what she ultimately became. She could have been any one of us.
The unsolved ones, we have to stand up
and approach these cases in a way outside the box.
Let the world know, is those out there that did commit a murder, there are people that are coming after you.
There's just a lot of good people trying to do the right thing.
Because it's something that you have to be passionate about.
Solve this, bring some peace to the family at least. Just doing my job.
The Paw, a large town in northern Manitoba, known as the Gateway to the North. Built initially on the fur trade, the Cree First Nations people call it Opasquia, or Highwood Narrows. English settlers would then shorten that name to simply the Paw.
By the late 60s, driven by the pulp and paper industry, the Paw was quite a boom town. Good place to get a job. It's great if you like the outdoors. It's a good tourist destination.
But like any other boomtown, there are negatives that come with economic prosperity and a transient workforce.
It had a kind of a Wild West feel to it as well. Substance abuse, violence, and even prostitution was not uncommon.
The Paw is also unique in that bordering the town are two Indigenous reserves and one Métis settlement. Tensions and racist attitudes between the predominantly white town and its neighbors were not uncommon.
When I got to the Paw, got off the train and went to barracks. I lived in barracks at the detachment. One of the chaps at coffee said, "Well, get ready to fight." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're the new kid in town, then we'll see how tough you are." Saturday at noon, I had my first fight. That's the kind of town it was. And he was right. They want to see how tough you are. And so they try you.
While the Paw had its rough edges, no one would be prepared for what was about to happen. When on a chilly November morning in 1971, a young man would make a discovery in the woods 20 miles northeast of the Paw. A father and son are off on a fishing expedition on a cold, miserable morning at Clearwater Lake. The boy is just 14. The wind coming off the water is damp and biting, so he goes for a wander looking for rabbit tracks.
The young man followed the trail and found something clearly wrong.
The father and son drive to the nearest phone and call the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, as Constables Tom Boyle and Don Knight, both in their early 20s, are dispatched.
Had just sat down to watch the TV and got a call. There's been a body found.
And all she was wearing were thick rubber boots.
At the time, they didn't have the availability of ready-made evidence kits. So they actually had to stop at the store and buy paper bags and tape in order to be able to collect the evidence.
I don't think you ever really prepare for that kind of stuff. I mean, through your training and of course your experience, you learn there's a routine to go through. You have to do certain things. And I was the exhibit guy, in other words, gathering all the exhibits and, making notes of the scene and that kind of thing. And things were totally different then.
This is prior to the use of using DNA for identification. So they relied heavily at that time on fingerprints, shoe prints, blood, and anything else at the crime scene.
There are many tracks suggesting that there was more than one person involved, at least in bringing the body to this location.
You could see that she was dragged into the bush, person on each side of her, where she was dragged to and dropped. And then there's 2 sets of tracks going out. So that meant 2 of them were involved, at least.
You know, they can't do plaster casts even. The shoe prints or footprints that have been left are already filling up with snow.
So they take photographs instead. And again, it's the 70s. Even photographs aren't the same as they are today.
He was involved in other murder cases, but this one here it was like they were in a frenzy. I mean, the number of stab wounds on her, the viciousness of it. You know, they'd put the boots to her.
The autopsy would later be in Winnipeg, but for now, the victim's body is taken to a local hospital for identification. The task made problematic by the fact that the face had been crushed or stomped in and had many puncture wounds.
It was going to be very hard to identify her and identify what killed her.
It's kind of hard to talk about, really, because, you know, those kinds of things you don't really forget. That somebody could actually do that to a human being is just unbelievable.
The first clue to the victim's identity are when the boots are removed, revealing a tattoo on her leg. Cornelius Biggity, I truly love you, no matter what. This would combine with a very recent missing persons report and give the victim a name, Helen Betty Osborne.
Where she had been staying, the lady said she hadn't come home and put in kind of a missing persons complaint. And so all of a sudden you put 2 and 2 together real quick. The lady said she couldn't do it, but the husband came down and basically said, yeah, that was her. And of course they identified her clothes too.
Not far from the body, the police would also discover the victim's clothes, bundled up and discarded.
On any murder investigation, from the moment the crime scene is discovered, from the moment the officers get there and have to enter that scene for the first time, the clock starts ticking for them. They know that the longer it takes, the more the evidence becomes degraded.
Who was she with at the time? Who was the last persons that saw her? That's where you start, you know.
Statistically, homicides are committed by people who are known to the victim. Not always, but in the vast majority of cases.
Now the police have their first suspect. They pick up Cornelius Biggity from the Puckatawagan Reserve and learn that he had been dating Helen Betty Osborne. Biggity also had been with her the night of her murder.
On the night she disappeared, you know, there'd been some drinking, some alcohol involved. There was an argument over a girl. So essentially the last time he saw her, she was walking home alone.
Biggity is interrogated for hours, but remains aloof, which leads the RCMP to believe he's hiding something. So they show him some photos from the murder scene.
When he sees the photos, Cornelius passes out, and the police decide to put him in a jail cell for a few hours.
The RCMP then turn to a polygraph or lie detector test to get the truth.
In the 1970s, the polygraph is an instrument that's used all over the world by police agencies to try to determine the truthfulness of somebody's statement. That measures their body's reaction while they're put under stress. Cornelius agrees to take a polygraph test, and the results of that test make it clear to the detectives that he's not a suspect in this matter.
But the interrogation would render a crucial clue. The night before Betty's body was found near Clearwater Lake, the investigators now could place her walking to the home where she was staying in the Pas.
She was a high school student, and she was billeting at a home that was near the school she was attending. The RCMP at the time went to her room and they found one of her school notebooks, and they were able to obtain a fingerprint from it. And from that fingerprint, they were able to positively identify the body of Helen Betty Osborne.
Helen Betty Osborne is born a First Nation Cree in 1952 in Norway House, a reserve in northern Manitoba.
She was the firstborn of Justine and Joe Osborne, a fur trapper. one of 8 siblings who all lived in a log cabin.
By the summer of 1969, she outgrows the education program and must either settle for grade 8 education or leave home to study further. Betty is known by her friends as bright and funny.
She had an interest in mathematics and participated in a program that helped integrate Indigenous students with white students in the PAW at Margaret Barbara Collegiate.
She went away to the PAW out of the safety and comfort of her community and her family so that she can get an education, so she can go back to her community and better her community.
In the PAW on the weekends, she sometimes goes to movies with Cornelius and her friends.
In 1971, where the movie theater was segregated in the community of the PAW at that time, they get spat on, they get called racial slurs anywhere they go. I'm sure if they went into a store, they were followed around and viewed with suspicion. Those were the attitudes and the prevailing attitudes of people who lived in the community.
To start with, we were knocking on doors, and once we found out who she was, where was she doing that night, and you go from there and you start talking to everybody that was at the bar that you knew at least or could find out who was there. You start talking to people in town if they heard anything. All it takes is one person if you get the right one.
Within days of Helen Betty Osborne's body being found, the community starts to realize that something horrible has happened. And pretty soon, they get an idea who may have been involved.
One of the very first leads in this case came from someone from the community, a cab driver who was driving out near the airport. He saw something that would be crucial in identifying who killed Helen Betty Osborne.
When the mutilated body of a young woman is found in a secluded wooded area near Clearwater Lake, northeast of the PAW, Manitoba, an investigation is launched by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP.
You could see that she was dragged into the bush, person on each side of her. They just brutalized her is what they did. It was like they were in a frenzy.
She's an Indigenous student from Norway House and soon identified as Helen Betty Osborne. The crime scene indicates multiple people were involved, and her tattoo leads investigators to a boyfriend. But after an initial interrogation, they realize it's not him.
Police are desperately going to streets, homes, and bars when a cab driver contacts them to say he's seen something suspicious.
He sees a white or a light blue car out on the road, and he sees something thrown from the window.
And incredibly, he remembers 2 numbers from the plate: 4-2.
A dog search of the highway where the cab driver saw the car would turn up a screwdriver and part of a woman's brassiere.
Screwdriver stabbed her in the face, which, punctured the skull and went into the brain. I mean, it's kind of hard to talk about really because, those kinds of things you don't really forget, That somebody could actually do that to a human being is just unbelievable.
It was inhuman what they did to her, how they violated her body, and the indignity of leaving her the way that they did.
On November 17th, Helen Betty Osborne makes front page news in the local paper. Parents from Northern Reserves take their kids out of school. Indigenous girls who stay in school are warned by their parents and landlords to walk in pairs or not go out at night at all.
Helen Betty's peers, other First Nation kids, other Indigenous kids that she was going to school with, police just went in and hauled them down to the police station, put them in cells. Even at that point in time, the law was fairly clear. The police did not have power to detain anyone unless they were charging them with a specific crime and arresting them accordingly. Clearly, what happened here is that someone was murdered and we need to clear it up. And it's probably likely one of these violent Indigenous or Aboriginal kids that have come from the reserve.
This is a very small rural town and people are starting to talk. rumors are starting to spread.
Now that there was a better idea of what the murder weapon was, there was some clarity or focus coming to the investigation. But there was still a question of whose vehicle it was.
It's not unusual for investigators to try new techniques to try to get a break in the case. And on this particular occasion, they turned to hypnosis, a first for RCMP, to try to find some information.
Under hypnosis, the cab driver now remembers 4 of the 6 characters.
The license plate and the description of the car point to a vehicle owned by the Colgan family in the Pas. But all the information they have at this point is hearsay and from unsubstantiated sources.
Meanwhile, Helen Betty Osborne is buried on a bitterly cold day. The family can't afford a tombstone, so they ask a man on the reserve to build her a wooden cross instead.
You really feel for the victim, of course, and you also feel for the victim's family, and that's one of the hard parts of the job.
They're dealing with these attitudes in the community where there's this hearsay and there's rumors and innuendo, and they're hearing snippets of information, but you can't make a case out of snippets of information. You have to go down and do the hard work.
It's a Friday in May when Constable Dawn Knight receives a letter in the mail that reveals details about the murder of Helen Betty Osborne.
This is an anonymous letter, but the author clearly appears to have intimate knowledge of the murder.
The letter indicates a young woman was in a car outside of a party with a young man who was intoxicated. The young man would share all kinds of things related to Helen Betty Osborne's murder. The anonymous letter mentions a confession from local boy Lee Colgan.
There are all kinds of rumors, some based on talk from Lee Colgan himself, who's been chatting a lot around town. And this brings into focus more suspects. This includes Colgan's neighbor and friend, Jim Houghton, and a young man who's known as a homeless drug addict, Norm Menger.
The author of the letter would later be revealed, in fact, to be a relative of the girl that sat in the car with Colgan. She didn't even live in the Pas, but she was still too afraid to come forward.
And then I ended up having an informant who told us that there was a 4th guy by the name of Johnson who left town shortly thereafter. I knew his mother, who was a waitress at the hotel, and we used to see her all the time. Do you know where he is? She said, well, he left town just, and she basically put him right shortly after that incident, right? So we knew then probably Johnson's definitely involved as well.
The anonymous letter is huge. It confirms what investigators already suspected. Now they have something they can move on.
7 months after the murder of Helen Betty Osborne, RCMP obtain a warrant to search the Colgan family Chrysler.
Apparently, Lee Colgan had washed the exterior of the Colgan family car, but hadn't bothered to clean the interior.
There's 114 hairs found in the vehicle, namely the seat area.
Literally took the inside apart, and we found some material with a little clip, and it was, it was obvious it was from a brassiere, right? And we had found the brassiere on the highway, not that far from the pump house when they'd thrown it out. Their forensic lab in Regina actually said this clip fits that brassiere. Like they could match it up. So we knew.
And also, blood was located, and there was a blood match.
Not a DNA match, or a blood type, like the OAB types. The blood is similar to that of Helen Betty Osborne.
4 suspects and then a car, clearly connected to Helen Betty Osborne's murder.
We knew obviously she must have been in there, but who was there?
Things have changed so much, and so if they were able to collect DNA, if they were able to use some of the tools that we have at our disposal now, this is a case that was solvable at the time.
With the advancements that we've seen in forensic evidence analysis, this case likely would have been solved much quicker.
Now what police really need is someone to talk.
Police confront Lee Colgan about what they found, and he tells them to talk to local lawyer Darcy Bancroft.
All four tell police the same thing: talk to Darcy.
Shortly after the vehicle search, police pay a visit to the home of local lawyer Darcy Bancroft.
He was eccentric, had a virtual zoo in his house. Big cats, a couple of ocelots, a chameleon. Very strange.
At the time, an individual could in fact be charged with non-capital murder merely by being at the scene of a homicide. These four are all in the same boat if someone talks.
Darcy Bancroft was not a typical lawyer, and he was most definitely behind the coordinated silence in the death of Helen Betty Osborne. On November 13th, 1971, the mutilated body of Helen Betty Osborne is discovered in the woods near Clearwater Lake, north of the Pas, Manitoba.
You got the car, you got the body, found the screwdriver that was used to stab her. You've got all this stuff. What evidence do you have that puts them in the car? Anything that we did have was basically hearsay, right? And without witnesses to say, how are we going to get a conviction?
Osborne was in the car, but there's still lots to be known about what actually happened.
When the four suspects are talking, police approach their lawyer, Darcy Bancroft, neither of whom is willing to cooperate.
The Crown says, lay the charges now, it's going to get tossed at preliminary, and then you'll never be able to charge them. He actually said, he says, at some point, one of them may talk, and then you're going to have your evidence to lay the charges and make it stick.
The RCMP start putting pressure on, and they start following the suspects who are still in town. And they get permission to wiretap their phones. In the bars, police take an unorthodox approach to putting that pressure on and send the suspects screwdrivers as a message.
Letting the suspects know that they're watching and that they probably know a lot more than they actually realize they do.
Putting pressure on his clients, Darcy Bancroft writes a letter of warning to the RCMP to back off, and a second, vouching for their good character.
The idea of counsel now sending a letter to the Crown Attorney's office and saying, you better back off, that simply would not happen now. And it may have been certainly a different era and a smaller community.
The high-pressure tactics employed by the RCMP are getting some attention from above, which puts a chill on the investigation.
Time begins to pass. One of the key investigators, Don Knight, is transferred out of the region, with the case still lacking enough evidence to press charges.
It's very frustrating as an investigator to see a viable suspect basically walk away just because you don't have enough evidence, even though you know.
But if people know anything, they're not telling police, or they're simply afraid.
The anonymous letter that RCMP received speaks to the fear that some may have. Part of that fear may be of the local lawyer, Darcy Bancroft, an intimidating figure who's connected to the privileged class of the Pas.
Well, they didn't want to get involved because it had something to do with a person that they didn't value and really felt was beneath them. And so it wasn't any of their business. By getting involved and doing the right thing, perhaps meant for them that they also would be looked down upon by their neighbors of getting involved and helping these Indians at the time.
Up to this point, so many officers had been involved in this case, but it had just stagnated. They really had to just focus on the long-term strategy at this point.
The main suspects continue to live their lives. Lee Colgan marries and eventually ends up in British Columbia. The marriage is troubled as he abuses his spouse and struggles with alcohol addiction. After getting divorced, Colgan loses shared custody of their children because he threatens to kill his ex-wife. James Houghton also marries, moves to Alberta, and becomes a successful salesman who's known to friends and family as decent, caring, and generous. Dwayne Johnston is a stable family man living in British Columbia who socializes with a local biker gang and is rumored to have killed an Indigenous man back in Manitoba. Norm Manger is an alcoholic and living in British Columbia. As pressure builds on the RCMP, well over a decade after the death of Helen Betty Osborne, Officer Bob Urbanowski is officially assigned to the case.
A new investigator can be a very good thing. They bring new perspectives, they bring new insights.
Over the last 13 years, about 200 officers had looked over the case, but Urbanowski is the first one to be full-time.
Urbanowski spends the first 6 months in the PAW asking a lot of questions.
Urbanowski tries something new and places an ad in the Apposquean Times requesting the public's assistance in Betty's murder investigation. Amazingly, police get over 150 responses, and Urbanowski makes almost 200 inquiries, traveling to countless cities and towns, from Vancouver to Toronto.
He was like a dog with a bone, right? He just kept on it, kept on it, kept on it, and tried all kinds of different things, and finally one of them worked.
13 years later, the simple act of taking out an ad in the paper is the break that Urbanowski needed.
When Helen Betty Osborne is brutally murdered, RCMP hunt for clues and anyone who might know what happened. But residents of the PAW, Manitoba are reluctant to talk.
Evidence points to 4 young men. Their involvement seems to be the worst kept secret in town.
A lot of people don't want to get involved. It doesn't matter what their profession is. They don't want to get involved. I don't want to go to court. I don't want to get involved. And that happens. Which makes it hard to investigate sometimes because you got people that know stuff that just don't want to get involved.
After 13 years, the case gains momentum as RCMP officer Bob Urbanowski finds a new way to engage a town that for the most part has been silent.
Urbanowski needs one of these 4 suspects to break.
Lee Colgan is suffering with alcoholism and violence. He's definitely the weak link.
Sometimes people don't know that they have information, and so that ad, I think, was so important, and it obviously became very important.
For years, people have been talking about this. There's been rumors, the suspects themselves have talked about it.
Bob Urbanowski really brought that fresh perspective as well, to say that this isn't right, and there are pieces here that if we put together, we can make a case. And there are people who know. And now enough time has passed that maybe they're thinking about like what that means to them in terms of keeping this a secret.
And finally, someone sees the notice in the paper and decides to talk.
Andrea Wicharek responds to the Urbanowski ad. She's 14 when she hears Dwayne Johnston brag at a party. I stabbed her. I stabbed her. According to Wicharek, Johnston added that the murder felt great.
And they tore the car apart and will never get caught.
Most importantly, Wicharek is willing to take the stand. But then something else comes out. There's a whole other revelation.
And suddenly someone else in the PAW realizes they should speak up.
This new revelation is that Sheriff Gerald Wilson of the Paw runs into Colgan at the local Legion. He buys him alcohol and takes him back to his trailer in the hopes of eliciting a confession of some sort.
The sheriff would recall that Colgan's confession took place in maybe 1977 or 78, but doesn't come forward until 1986.
Sheriff, well, a peace officer, but not a police officer, whatever rationale he may have had to keep that a secret, I think is complete baloney. And I would say he had an obligation to pass that information on to the RCMP.
All the information that came out, even though it may be over a decade late, it couldn't be more significant.
Officer Obanowski visits Lee Colgan, armed with a witness willing to take the stand.
Urbanowski knows that of all the four suspects, Colgan is likely going to be the one who talks.
And he breaks his silence, the silence that started the day of the murder and continued until his father took him to see Darcy Bancroft, only to find out that Dwayne Johnson had already been at Bancroft's office.
At the end of the day, the Crown Attorney was right. Wait, someday it might happen, and it did.
Authorities arrest Lee Colgan at his parents' house and charge him with first-degree murder.
And he breaks the silence that started after the murder of Helen Betty Osborne. What authorities want to know now is who did what that night, who wielded the screwdriver, who murdered Helen Betty Osborne.
Norm Manger, James Houghton, Lee Colgan, and Dwayne Johnston are out drinking and cruising the town for sex.
They see Helen Betty Osborne walking alone and vulnerable. They pull her into their car.
The men use fake names with each other, so Helen won't be able to identify them later. Norm Manger is in front. James Houghton drives, with Colgan, Osborne, and Johnston in the back seat.
First, they go to Houghton's cabin, but Betty is screaming and yelling, and there's people around.
So they forced her back into the car and they moved on to a more secluded area.
I think they intentionally were going to rape her, and I think she just fought them off. So they decided, well, let's just do a number on her, and just there was no stopping them.
There was a lot of alcohol and drugs, but the initial version places Houghton and Johnson outside the car with Betty. Colgan and Manger inside the car when the worst of the beating happens. Manger is extremely drunk.
Stabbed her numerous times, put the boots to her. It's just a vicious, vicious attack. And dumped her body out there. And just drove away as if nothing happened.
Of course they thought they could get away with it because in the viewpoint that they had, this was just an Indian that we picked up and nobody's going to care.
Dwayne Johnston is arrested at his home in Revelstoke, British Columbia. Lee Colgan and Dwayne Johnston are to attend a preliminary hearing, but minutes prior, Colgan is offered full immunity if he testifies against Johnston.
Better off to get some convicted than none, because without Colgan making a deal, he wasn't going to testify. There was 2 people that dragged her body in and 2 people came out. Mangers, if you believe Colgan, is passed out in the car.
It's essentially a case of what's the first rat off the ship. His lawyer was obviously able to have discussions with the Crown Attorney in terms of working out a deal for him.
Colgan gives police enough evidence to charge Jim Houghton, and he's arrested on a friend's porch in Alberta and charged with first-degree murder. 16 years after the murder of her daughter, Justine Osborne finds out about the arrests from the radio.
You got to bring some sort of closure to the family. And that's really hard to do sometimes because, families, and you can't blame them. I mean, they get upset. What are you guys? You're not doing your job, that kind of thing. And you know what? It's a hard job to do sometimes.
They've been suffering for years, and there's still a trial to face.
James Houghton and Dwayne Johnston's murder trial begins at 10:30 a.m. From the 104 jury prospects, 20 Indigenous people are eliminated, leaving an all-white 2-woman and 10-man jury. Because he agrees to turn evidence against the others, Lee Colgan cannot be held liable for the murder of Helen Betty Osborne.
Norman Manger, although he was inside the car, wasn't charged.
When the girl testified that Johnson had said, I stabbed her, I stabbed her, and I stabbed her, no brainer for the jury. Definitely he's one of the killers, right? We don't know who the other one is, so we're not going to convict. They had a reasonable doubt.
For those 4 men, no one was really held accountable. Perhaps the one, and it just doesn't sit right at all.
Not happy with only getting 1 convicted. That's unfortunately, that's our system, and that's what the jury felt.
2 days later, the Manitoba Attorney General commences an investigation into why the Paw Sheriff, Gerald Wilson, did not reveal the confession that Lee Colgan had made to him in the late 70s.
Another inquiry would be launched by local leaders in the Paw. And 2 months later, Sheriff Gerald Wilson would be demoted for withholding information.
The sheriff claims that everyone in town was aware of the information, and the RCMP should have been as well. That's why he didn't do anything.
A short time later, Sheriff Gerald Wilson is reinstated after an arbitration hearing.
What little credit I can give him is that he acknowledged that racism, that this wasn't his neighbor's daughter. This was some Indigenous girl he didn't know. And at the time, who cared about them? Certainly not him.
The province launches the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry.
Helen Betty Osborne's case and what happened was one of the ways to highlight just how much injustice there was for Indigenous people at the time. And it's still ongoing.
The inquiry finds many problems, pointing to the failure by authorities in the Paw. It also finds problematic that all 4 of the suspects were early on represented by a single lawyer, Darcy Bancroft.
She definitely was a symbol for change of this idea that you cannot just throw away Indigenous women. You cannot just use them and abuse them, throw them away and think nothing is going to happen and that you'll get away with it.
Dwayne Johnston becomes eligible for parole after serving only 7 years of his sentence and begins a day parole program.
But about 200 protesters walk 800 kilometers from the north to Winnipeg in April 1996 to protest. Johnston's parole is revoked.
Unexpectedly, Dwayne Johnston participates in a healing circle from jail with the RCMP and the Osborne family.
Johnson claims he did not participate in the murder and identifies James Robert Houghton as the killer. They had made a pact and that they had all taken turns stabbing Helen's body with the screwdriver to keep them all bound to silence.
This conversation between Johnston and the family is leaked to the media. Already, lawyers for the other two accused are arguing they can't get a fair trial with this taped conversation out there.
Who knows if Johnson's extremely belated confession is reliable? One person certainly knows what happened.
Darcy Bancroft, initially the lawyer for the 4 suspects, was most probably the only person to hear all first-hand accounts in his office.
The inquiry has now reached the end of phase 1 of its work.
The Aboriginal Justice Inquiry also finds problematic and highlights in its conclusions that all 4 suspects were early on represented by a single lawyer, Darcy Bancroft. Darcy Bancroft would die only a few years after the death of Helen Betty Osborne, at age 30. His law partners would then destroy his files.
He should have said, look, I can't act for all 4 of you. For example, Colgan, who probably told him, I didn't do anything. I know what they did, but I didn't do anything. He said, well, then, you know what? You better get your own lawyer. I'll act for you, and those guys will have to get a different lawyer because I can maybe make a deal for you right now. But he didn't do that. And so he just told them all to be quiet.
The Indigenous community came together and said, this needs to stop. This is a person who was going to bring value to her community by being a school teacher and teaching the next generation. And it was just cut short. For what? Because these 4 individuals decided that she wasn't worth anything, that they can use her and discard her.
It can't be forgotten that someone did have the courage to come forward and speak and testify. And that person wouldn't have come forward if she hadn't seen that story in the paper.
Lucky because that young boy found the body, or at least saw the body early on. Otherwise, you know, it might have never been solved.
She's been a symbol for change in the late 1980s and early 90s that we have to stop devaluing our women in this way. It has to stop.